In this lesson, we're going to explore the use of SIRP in education, because you see, SIRP makes learning sticky, and we want learning to stick. It's pronounced like syrup, Texas style, syrup. So where do we get syrup? No, not here, but from a book. The idea for SIRP comes from Brown, Roediger, and McDaniel's 2015 book, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It will be one of the easiest reads you'll find on the science of learning. SIRP is obviously an acronym, so let's break it down. SIRP is Spaced, Interleaved, Retrieval Practice. Let's think about it this way. How do you prepare for a test? Not one you're giving, one you're taking. How do your students prepare for a test? Cramming is by far the most common form of studying. Test tomorrow? I'll study all night. Next, rereading. I read the chapter 4 times, or I read it once, I highlighted, I underlined, and then went back and reread. The problem is we don't tend to retain the information long term when we study these ways, and this is a big problem. Because our students, your students, are going to be nurses and engineers and bankers and lawyers, and we need them to know their stuff, not just know how to look it up. How many of you think we give too many tests? I wonder if we don't give enough. Tests can be about gatekeeping, weeding out the unwise from the wise, the good students from the bad. Tests can also be about measurement. How much did the students learn? Did they meet the learning objectives? Both of these paradigms are still held by many faculty, and the measurement paradigm is actually a good one. But I would like to propose to you another paradigm about testing, and that is testing as a learning activity rather than as an assessment. And that's where we get our hands in the syrup. We'll start by talking about the end of the acronym. SIRP. RP stands for Retrieval Practice. Retrieval practice has many levels. It is evidence of learning, and it is practice for learning because it builds long-term memory. For the purpose of this presentation, I will assume you are already in the top levels of learning when it comes to your understanding of Bloom's taxonomy. But keep this in mind today, because retrieval practice applies to more than the knowledge level. When you explain or describe something, you are actively retrieving the information as you're talking about it. When you do an operation or a task, you are retrieving the steps as you go. The point of all this is that retrieval practice, the act of recalling information from your memory, has been shown in numerous studies to be incredibly effective for long-term retention of information. That is, the more you recall it, the longer you'll remember it. So retrieval practice is good, but not all forms of retrieval practice are equal. Evidence shows that spacing out study sessions and doing a little at a time enhances long-term learning. So if we're spacing it out, how often, you ask? How long should one go before trying to recall the information? Just long enough to arrest forgetting, as Brown et al. Say. It's different for everyone in every learning circumstance. There's probably no way to identify a target time. Brown writes, while any kind of retrieval practice generally benefits learning, the implication seems to be that where more cognitive effort is required for retrieval, greater retention results. And we, the faculty, the course designers, can intentionally schedule the intervals for retrieval practice. The next important variable is interleaving. When we interleave our retrieval practice, we don't just study the same topic. We don't just do the same thing over and over. We interleave different information, which makes the studying more difficult as we try to differentiate math from grammar, biology from writing, previous course content with current course content. And it makes it feel less productive, but research has shown definitively that it is more productive than studying one subject at a time. Mixing up your practice helps you remember better than massed practice. When you interleave your practice, your ability to transfer learning from one situation to another improves. You can take a skill outside of the classroom and use it at home. Or perhaps more importantly for how we're preparing our students, use it at work and in the many paths of life. So spaced interleaved retrieval practice. This is a way to think about mixing up our students' practice in the classroom. Exactly how that looks will be different for all of you, depending on your subject matter, the scope and sequence of your course, and the types of learning outcomes you're trying to reach. So stir in some syrup when you design your classes, and you can make learning sticky too. Here's Emily to explain how.
Now that you're convinced that this is a good idea for your classes, we're going to give you some tips for implementing this in your classrooms. Some key things to remember. This can be just some small assessments or activities that you're having students do throughout class. They could occur before, during, or after lessons in the classroom. And it is important to remember that you need to mix previous content with current content. So while you may be in the practice of formatively assessing throughout a lesson, a key part of implementing this SIRP strategy is to be very aware that you are also bringing back topics that have been covered in previous sections of the course. Spacing is that idea that you are practicing outside of the specific lesson. It could be days or weeks after a lesson or unit that you are remembering to bring previous topics back up. And when you are initially learning to implement spacing, it might be a good idea to write yourself down a schedule so that you remember to revisit those topics within certain intervals. To interleave just means that you are mixing up topics on these review activities that you are presenting your students. You are asking them to revisit material that they previously learned out of that context of that particular unit or chapter. You want to ask them to recall that previous material and to recognize that type of question when it comes back up again out of the context of how it was originally presented. In a typical class, you could plan for these activities to occur at any point. It could be at the beginning of class when students walk into the room, or at the beginning of an online module. They could be spaced in different points throughout your lesson, or you could have students turn in something at the end of a lesson to gauge where they are. One tool you could use to create these exercises for students, especially if you're already teaching online, is the quiz feature of your learning management system. You could easily place a short quiz within a lesson or module. If you want this to be informal, you can exclude this from the students' grades if you would like. It is good for collecting data. So if you really want that information about what students might still be struggling with, this is a good tool to use. And also, if you're already teaching online, this won't require you to learn any additional technology. You might want to try using a quizzing application to create some of these exercises for students. If you want your students to have a very gamified experience, you might try an app such as Kahoot, which is an interactive game that can be played either simultaneously, or if you're teaching online, you can even assign Kahoots asynchronously, and the students can compete with one another in various ways. A Quizlet is an online flashcard system where you can create decks for students to study, or they can create their own decks, or they can create decks and share with each other. This is a great way to review and revisit topics and vocabulary throughout a semester or unit. You could also use a form system such as Microsoft or Google Forms. Both of those are extremely similar. Your choice would depend on what your university is using. These forms can be completed synchronously or asynchronously. One of the benefits of using a form would be that you will collect the data so that you can see where your students are with certain topics. And you could decide from what you learn on those forms, what you might need to do next. But these are just a very few examples of quizzing applications that you could use. There are many more. Choose the one that appeals to you. There are many different resources you can use to explore this topic further. One website that we highly recommend is retrievalpractice.org. At retrievalpractice.org, you will find detailed information on the research behind this set of strategies, as well as implementation tips and tools. You will also find a set of books and other resources that you can use in addition to this website to provide additional information. Powerful Teaching, Make It Stick, and Small Teaching are three that we recommend that you take a look at if you're interested in implementing this strategy into your courses. This presentation was presented by David Christianson and Emily Perritt.
And unless otherwise noted, all pictures were sourced from pixabay.com.